Could we invite forward the Monocled Mutineer?
So let's start this debate by asking Paul really, I mean, what's your reaction now having seen it? You probably haven't seen it since the period there. What's your reaction now seeing the whole programme? Does it seem as controversial looking back at it now?
The thing is, it didn't feel controversial to shoot it. I mean, as far as we didn't... when we read the script, it was a Bleasdale. It's earned its sort of infamy and its controversy later. It was, the script, as you can see there, is a lot of myth making and actually not a bad answer. Did you choose it?
Yeah.
Half an hour to choose it, because you see the different kind of different aspects of it. Particularly that there he is, this dubious sort of anti-hero character, quite cold, almost sort of cerebral, out for himself, amidst these kind of ardent lads, red flag flyers, proto-socialists, rioters, and
he's quite cynical, isn't he?
well, he is, and this is, Bleasdale deliberately wrote it and wrote him like that, in a way he doesn't touch the sides. And Alan once said that, I wish he was here, Alan, don't you wish he was here to remember it for us and kind of speak for himself. But, he was deliberately after some, I remember, because Alan was there for quite a lot of the shoot, and it was months of it, and he'd show up and then he'd come back and he'd write and he'd come back and he'd sit with us. And it was the first big thing that I'd done, so I was kind of keyed up and nervous and not quite trying to find my feet. And where he could, Alan was really helpful. But I remember, we'd sit, we'd have a pint, and he'd say, look, he said, think of it like it's a cross between Cool and Luke and John Lennon. Things like that. And but we kind of, because I wasn't Alan's first choice, Alan was famous in those days for, he almost had like a little rep company of actors that he would use, Michael Angelis, Julie Walters, Drew Schofield, of course, who he wanted for the role. And I was kind of cast despite him a little bit. So we spent the first few weeks, Alan wasn't exactly bitter about it, but he was sort of watching me really. And then weeks in, he kind of helped me out. And as we found our feet together, begin to work. But that's a good clip of the whole sort of 6 hours of it, because you see Topless caring and not caring. In a sense, he was kind of out for himself. And very much, from you get a sense, as we later find, and all Alan ever purported it to be, he took Alison Fairn's book. He took, Topless had kept a diary. The diary was found on his corpse when he was murdered. And, Alan had sort of picked it up and run with it and invented this character.
But he doesn't come across as the kind of anti-hero. He comes across, I think, it starts off with him in the brothel, doesn't it, with the prostitutes. And that it's made clear that he sort of disrupts his time for prostitutes.
He was a rebel, but like you say,
the kill, doesn't he?
Yeah. And this is very much what Alan wanted. Alan wanted to say something about the war, say something, if you like, connected to the times we were living in then.
He's a con man, isn't he? At the end.
And the Topless character was just, it's a little like, a couple of weeks ago I heard Jimmy McGovern on the radio talking about the latest, what's it called? Banished in Australia. And the interviewer asking him, well, are these characters real? He said, some of them. Did they exist? Yes, some of them. He said, I've sort of added a few of my own. All the things that Bleasdale was saying, the prelude to the release of the Monocled Mutineer. The controversy ensued, but at the beginning, Alan was very much, Alan said, I wrote it down somewhere. Alan said that he describes, I wish you were here, but at least we've got some of the things that he did say. he said, he was actually asked to do, Alan was asked to write the Monocled Mutineer in 1981 and he refused it. He said, I don't do adaptations, fair enough. But then something made him change his mind. And he said that my granddad had died on the Western Front 6 months before my dad was born. He said, I found that a great pull to the story. And then later on in the Radio Times, he described, before the Monocled Mutineer was released, the first episode went out, Alan said, describing it in the Radio Times, he says, it's a costume drama with something to say about the times we live in. He said, I studied history books people in power wanted me to read. I've never learned what it was like for a man to go to war, for a common man and a common soldier to go through those times. So this was Alan's, this was his plan. You know, the Alison and Fairley book, you know, Alan had his opinions about it, like everyone had their opinions about it. You know, he saw holes in it. But for example, in the Topless Diary, famously there was a single reference to a woman called Dorothy. It said something like, you know, April 6th, sea houses with Dorothy, or something like that. Now Alan makes, you know, there's no other reference to this woman, who she was. She may well have been one of these women that he was consorting with in London, we don't know. But it was there in his diary. Now Alan makes the whole Jerry Lungi character out of that single reference. This was his job, like Jimmy's with the, you know, the present-day Australian drama. That's what he does. And you know, dramatic license is what it is. You know, he sets up the kind of the obstacles, the struggle, the rebellion, the confusion. You know, they're all, in effect, they're all modern-day westerns. That was Alan's job. And that's what we see, we get a really good sense of watching just that 30 minutes there. And the way that the Topless character sort of glides around. Later on, he even calls the 4th episode a dead man on leave. I don't know where he got the expression from. But I think it might have been while we were shooting, he decided on this.
It was actually contemporary.
It was a contemporary
sardonic comment, yes.
Yeah.
There for the Western Front on home.
You're a dead man on leave. And so he got this, you know, the idea to call this final episode. But I remember he and I were sitting in a pub one night, as we used to, when we were sort of sitting talking about the work. And I remember saying, I've got it. He said, look, this is how you should do it. He said, because we've both been reading about these, aside from anything else, although it wasn't included in the final series, is that there were also contemporary, the men would describe supernatural things, stuff that they were hearing, stuff that they were seeing, things that you couldn't explain. They were meeting fellas that had died the week before, this kind of thing, you know. And Alan said to me, we sat there one night, and he said, you know what? He said, play it. We were arguing through the shoot, and he said, play the rest of it like he's a ghost. He's gone already. You're one of those fellas that Jim just met on the road, and he finds out later that you were dead like 3 weeks. He's one of them. You're a dead man on leave. This is what. And he said, and it's an impressionistic thing, but he said, this is how you should do it. You're not going to touch the sides. You're there, but you're not there. You know. And Alan was very much for that sort of idea that Topless. It was only when Topless began to care, whether it was for Dorothy or whether it was for the cause, anything, that he loses his life. This is how he wanted it. And that's what you get a sort of glimpse of there.
What's your take on that whole position of an historical drama with a playwright? I mean, do you feel as though it has to be historically accurate, or is it trying to get across the characters more? What's your position? Does it need to be? Because it was criticised for its factual accuracy. But what's your take on that as an actor?
Well, this has become almost. You could write a book about this, you know, this single subject. You know, the historical accuracy of period dramas. There is no historical accuracy about period dramas. I mean, that's the short answer. It's all receiving. You know, Monocled Mutineer, we made this in '86. What you're seeing is World War I through the prism of the late 20th century thinking about World War I. TV's like that. TV drama was much more like that then anyway. You had sort of captive audiences of 10 million people. Well, you know, almost getting a domesticated view of history through the television. That's what TV is, TV drama does. You know, there's this, you know, I mean, we could be here all night talking about it, but it's a sort of magic realism thing. You know, and Bleasdale was a great playwright and he was well in on it. You know, but it's the same now. Whether it's Downton Abbey, whether it's, it's a discourse. It's TV talking about history, talking about TV, talking about history. It's a hall of mirrors. There is no historical accuracy. You know, if somebody set out to try and make 60 years after the event something absolutely historically accurate, you know, the profs like you could say, yep, absolutely dead on, can't fault it. It might not be, even in the slightest sense, dramatic. You still have to have, you know, the...
Yeah, if I just come in on that, I mean, because this is a subject which goes back to Shakespeare. Henry V is historically pretty inaccurate, but of course it's a marvellous character study of power, it's a study of a charismatic leader. I mean, watching Monocled Mutineer, actually the first time since 1986, apart from the fact making me think, gosh, 30 years had passed, I was a sort of young postgrad when I saw it the first time. It struck me as actually what fine drama it is. And actually, I could pick holes in terms of certain bits of historical accuracy. So, for example, there were no Australians at its art by the time of the Mutiny. They'd been moved on. What if that was a move to sell the series in Australia like one of the Aussies in? Minor things, like everybody had post-National Health Service teeth. Whereas the average working class soldier would have had teeth all over the place.
We had to say about Bull Fall, didn't we?
And actually, the way that people talked rather, the officers would have had accents which would sound laughably cut glass to us. In fact, if you go to the Imperial War Museum and listen to the oral history programme, you can get some officers from that period, and they sound like, you know, complete caricatures. Likewise, the accents of the ordinary soldiers, I think was, I mean, dumbed down is the wrong word, but actually they would be much more difficult for us to understand these days, because regional accents were that much stronger. The underlying problem, I think, with the authenticity of that program. Actually, that's the wrong word. The implication is that the mutiny really put the British Army of 1917 under strain. It reflected the enormous problems. In fact, there's a great deal of work that's been done on this, that actually the point that's made, I think, by Brigadier Thompson, by the Timothy West character early on, this is really about the fact that the soldiers are really hacked off. They hate the disciplinary system. They don't like the assistant provost marshal Strawn. They don't like. It's actually, in effect, it's an industrial strike relocated into khaki. And in fact, if you look at it in the round act,
or a prison riot.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, except I think that the strike analogy is closer, because the British working class was the most heavily unionised group in European society pre-war. Many people carried the idea that if your bandages would work, you down tools until something changes. What it isn't, or what it wasn't, I should say, is an attempt to sort of strike a blow at the army or the war or the government. And of course, one of the reasons I like that scene that you just shown is actually the ambiguity is there quite nicely. There are some proto-objects, there were some waving of red flags, picked from French ladies' drawers from the American scene. But actually for most people there, they were fed up with the way they were being treated, and actually they wanted to break out of camp and go to Paris Plage and have a drink.
On the question of, because you've written extensively on the army itself, I mean, Thompson, there's a point where Thompson goes back, doesn't he, about his life before 1914.
Sure.
And I thought that was very well drawn, you know, that Thompson was, more carefree, he said, than he before then. What about that as a character? Do you think that it wasn't as sort of starkly critical of an officer as I thought it was going to be honest?
No, and actually I'm ashamed to say I don't actually know whether that event that he mentioned of the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Sir John French, who certainly was the CIG's before the war, dressed him down. But certainly that was the sort of thing that French might have done. No, I thought it was quite a sympathetic drawing. I mean, my memory from the series that the one Masters who does come across is the APM Captain Strachan. But
The previous episode.
indeed, but Thompson comes across as quite a sympathetic figure. And one of the key things which actually kept British Army morale going in the First World War was on the whole the sympathetic, paternal relationship of the officers at all levels towards the men. And that's actually one of the reasons why there was such a sort of tinderbox atmosphere at Etape in September 1917, was because the paternal regimental officers were nowhere to be seen. You had these military police, certainly they weren't all red caps, because red caps were particularly sort of military police, and people who surprisingly weren't mentioned, the Canaries, who were the NCO instructors who wore yellow armbands. They were the ones who were really hated. And actually, some people seriously preferred to be in a frontline unit where they had sympathetic and officers and NCOs who could protect them from the worst excesses of the army. And so really, Etape in 1917 is, you imagine all the worst bits of the army dumped in one place at one time, and it's a really, really explosive atmosphere. And I must say, I thought that actually, it was subtly hinted at in that scene we saw.
Gary, what was the level of mutiny in the British Army during the First World War? How many mutinies were there?
It was remarkably low. This one is the only major mutiny which took place involving British as opposed to colonial, by which I mean basically on white troops, while the war was going on. There's a whole series of very minor mutinies. The mutiny could involve three people. Now, after the war, when the answers had been declared, there was basically what the army would have classified as mutinies going on left, right and centre. The discipline of the army effectively collapsed. There's a very good reason for that. The men had joined the army to beat the Germans, whether they volunteered or they'd been conscripted. They regarded they'd signed up to do a job. And suddenly they'd done the job, I've had enough, I want to go home. So all sorts of things that took place from refusing to turn out for a regimental football team, up to actually burning down Luton Town Hall in the process, which was a bit excessive. But the British Army is the only army that fights on the Western Front from beginning to end, which doesn't undergo a major issue. The French do, the Germans do, on the Eastern Front the Russians do. The British are a remarkably well-disciplined army.
Coming back to the actual the controversy that were around the later war, there were some major sorts of factual inaccuracies brought up. How did you feel about that? The idea that it was said that Topless was not actually at the mutiny. How did you feel when that sort of controversy started to go? Where do you stand on that now? Because it is still up in the air, isn't it, whether he was there or he wasn't there?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, 100 years later, I was still not quite sure where he was, where he wasn't.
So Captain Woodhall was the guy who went after Topless, wasn't he?
You know, I remember even reading the script and beginning to work on the BBC series, having read Alison Fairley's book. You know, if you read Alison Fairley's book, it's notable for it's the dearth of footnotes, there's no bibliography, it is what it is, there's a lot of sort of oral history in there, it's quite breathless and it's a great yarn. But even as a kid I remember thinking, bit of a tall tale, but I'm pleased that script, was fantastic, had a bit of pace to it, but accurate. You never thought you were working on something that was accurate anyway, but then we weren't meant to be.
Yeah.
Really, the misfortune of the series, Monocled Mutineer, was to be released when it was. Weirdly, interestingly, I think I was the third or the fourth actor that had been given the role. I might be wrong there, but it was the third or fourth attempt to stage the series, to mount the series, since 1981. I spoke to a couple of guys actually who I know, who'd been given the role before, and that's the thing had fallen through. Had it, say, gone out in 82, 81, 82, it probably would have escaped the kind of...
Before the Falklands?
Yeah, just at a different period before Thatcher's second government, say, or... The problem for this particular vintage, for the Monocled Mutineer that we made, and it's coming out in 1986, bang in the middle of, again, we could be here all night describing it, but it was, in a sense, one of the worst times of political controversy. The BBC was basically getting battered by the then government. There was all kinds of shenanigans going on. They were being sued in the courts, they were being censored. We could go into it, but some of it's fantastic. But, they'd even placed their own Director General in there, Stuart Young, to try and give them the Thatcher's government, more of a sympathetic hearing. He up and died 3 days before we opened, right? Aged about 53. God bless him. So suddenly they didn't have a man as the Director General. Tebbit was doing his McCarthy thing, trying to weed out pinkos and lefties in the BBC. They had this Alistair Milne, who was the I can never remember all their titles.
DG.
He was the DG. They were after ousting him. They wanted him out. He'd been there 20 odd years. They fell foul over that Zircon satellite program that got out. The Sweeney Reagan BBC Scotland offices in Glasgow, seizing all their equipment. They were strange times. The Monocled Mutineer, I can say that its misfortune really was coming out in that particular August, bang in the middle of all this controversy and political shenanigans when it did, and really running right into it. Because it didn't take long, like after the first episode had gone out, for suddenly these accusations of it started really that the political, the military inaccuracies and the historical holes in it were actually nothing. They were nothing, but they became an excuse, a conduit to have a go at the thing, and by association to have a go at the BBC for
I
political.
think the Liverpool had one played a part. You were from Liverpool, these days from Liverpool.
No, I don't remember it. No. If it did, it went over my head completely. Alan was really, Alan Bleasdale was really on the back foot. He was going on the TV defending himself over really just for doing his job.
I think one of the problems about the historical authenticity is the BBC marketing or media department, whatever they're called, very ill-advisedly said that this actually is based on solid facts.
Yeah.
Actually, as Paul's actually suggested, the Alison fairly book that it's based upon, but I think it's probably best treated as a historical novel. And certainly, Julian Bukowski, who was the historical advisor, wrote a very good piece after the programme had come out, basically pointing out all of the errors and faults involved in the series, many of which he actually flagged up, but simply been ignored. If it's taken as being a historical drama loosely based on historical events, put it out today, no one would have a problem with it. But it was absolutely right. It's slap bang in the middle of a very deep political crisis in which the BBC is at the centre of it. About Percy Topless, I actually don't think he was there at the time. Or put it that way, I've seen no convincing evidence to persuade me that he was there. But actually, if you take Topless out of it, obviously from the point of view of drama,
no drama.
You don't have a drama. And so
There's no cool in the loop.
indeed, so Percy Topless is, I think, a stroke of genius to put in there as a central figure to hang the story around. If you'd gone up with a sort of historical health warning at the beginning, I really don't think there would have been a problem. But maybe that's looking back from 30 years, and then, as you rightly say,
Yeah,
things are
that's a
very...
good point. I think that's a good point, Gary. That
It's the only thing to remember. The beam shot itself in the foot. Again, very contemporary problem. You know, part of the Peacock Report, and which is looking into the future of the BBC at the time, 85, 86. You know, shall they take advertising? You know, this was all going on. It's right bang in the middle. And what the Beaver just done under Mill was taken on an advertising agency to sell its drones. I think they called them BBC Worldwide in those days, but it was brand new. And so, I remember, you may remember yourselves, anyone that's old enough, there were these sort of full-page advertisements in the newspapers, in all of them. And I remember that there was sort of quarter, there was a picture. I had a picture of me as Percy and something else, some fella getting his head stoked in or whatever. It would say, mutiny. There, and there was a picture there, kidnap. And I was trying to flog this thing. And then with a strapline saying, something like not even based on, a true story starts at 9 p.m. And of course it wasn't a true story. And that was it then. That was all. This was it. It was suicide. So the people wrote to the newspapers, the cabinet, there were questions in Parliament, and all bets were off. And suddenly, so really, that's the context. That's what happened.
When you look at the whole series, I don't know that everyone's seen the whole series, but when you look at the whole series, Topless comes across as not a heroic figure. He's quite nasty, isn't he?
It's more interesting.
He makes money out of when we were older and stuff like that. And the other episodes, if you've never seen that, I suggest you watch the whole thing. So
it's the best kind of character to play. I'm not a writer, but I'm sure it's one of the best things to sit down and try to write.
And you've played a lot of characters like that since your own
career imposter.
That's Sweet Revenge.
Yeah, but it's like, bogus doctors, and actors playing actors. They're great roles to play. And, who wants to be the good guy? You know what I mean? I'm sure for the writers, Jimmy McGovern would probably say the same thing. It's, they're more interesting, they're more multifaceted. Topless is interesting because he's, he is this ambiguous figure. As an audience, we're not asked to give him our allegiance. We're not. That's not what he's there for. He's there as something else. It's almost a Brechtian device. You're asked to look at his. We're asked to entertain the idea anyway that his virtues might be the exact opposite, the mirror image of his faults. This is what he's there for. You've seen in other works. You like Cool Man Luke. That's what it's for.
He's a bad boy, isn't he?
He was a charming bad boy. But through it comes the message.
Yeah.
The fact is, even in the scenes we just saw, he could have led those men. We're asked to believe that he's got the talent, and they say, "Oh, Percy, you're marvelous. You stand up and do the talking." He could have led those men, those socialists, that ragtag bobtail outfit. But he ain't going to. That's not what he's there for. What he's going to do is he's going to look after himself, and he's going to look after himself. And that's what Alan wanted. That's how this was the device. Jimmy does the same thing. Writers, these are good characters to write. And they're the best ones to play, like I said, because they don't.
So when you believe you play that character, does it led on to all these complex characters?
Yeah, obviously personally, it's a great role.
But you could have ended up just a romantic lead, couldn't you?
Not if I can. Not if I can. There's no future in it.
We've all seen the D.H. Lawrence.
There's no future in it. Everyone turns 39, 45. It doesn't last for long. But it's weird. But no, they're the roles to play.